Up next is Dr. Alice Horton. She's an anthropogenic contaminant scientist with an expertise in microplastic pollution. In addition, experimental studies on the exotoxicological effects of microplastics and organic chemicals on aquatic and terrestrial invertebrates.
Yes, sure. So thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me to speak here today. My name is Dr. Alice Horton and I work at the National Oceanography Centre in Southampton in the UK. I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about the concept of the plastic cycle with some examples from land, rivers and the oceans. So firstly, I just wanted to start with an image that details plastic production. So you can see how much plastic production has increased in the last few decades, starting in around 1950 up until now. We've had an almost exponential increase in the amount of plastic that's produced. We know, however, that this means that while plastics are very useful and we need them for a lot of different purposes, of course, a lot of this plastic ends up being discarded, and then a lot of this ends up within the environment. And we know that this, of course, is a big problem now. It's important to note when we talk about plastics that plastics are not just one thing. So we need to consider that plastics comprise lots of different polymer types, lots of different shapes of particles and items, lots of different sizes. So we talk about macroplastics, which are large plastic items, or microplastics, which I'll talk a bit more about. All these polymers have different additive chemicals to give them different properties, and they all behave in different ways. So this image gives an example of this. This is looking at microplastics specifically. So we've got beads, fibres and fragments, and these can be broken down into different categories. So beads or pellets tend to be called primary microplastics because they're manufactured to be of a small size, whereas fibres and fragments are what we would call secondary microplastics because they have broken down unintentionally from a larger item. So just to give a definition of microplastics, a few people have already discussed this within this webinar, but this is the definition given by the European Chemicals Agency. Microplastic is a solid polymer particle. It's less than 5 millimeters in size. It's insoluble in water and it's very resistant to biodegradation. So we have lots of different ways in which microplastics can be formed and can enter the environment. So I mentioned already these beads tend to be used as a primary feed source for making lots of different plastic products, but we know that lots of these end up within the environment. We also have things like synthetic fibres, which derive from laundry. We have fragments, we have glitter, so cosmetics, for example, and also dust that's formed from our day-to-day lives, such as in construction, while we're using the roads, while we're driving our vehicles, and so on. So there are lots of different sources of microplastics. And if we think about how these are released to the oceans and into the environment, we can see here on the left-hand side that around 98% of plastics that enter the oceans are believed to be derived from the land. So this is a huge proportion. This really means that we need to focus our efforts on this upstream part of the cycle, so where plastics enter the system. Around 66% of that is believed to be derived from road runoff, but we also have wastewater as quite a large proportion. What we can see on the right-hand side is that actually only around 48% of the plastics on land are released to the ocean. And it is believed that 52% of these plastics will be retained on land and within soils. So it's not necessarily the case that all plastics will end up within the ocean. And this is important for us to remember when we're talking about plastic pollution. It's not just ocean pollution. So if we think about this in terms of a cycle, we often hear about how plastics start on land, they travel via rivers and they end up within the oceans. But we know, of course, that the system is a lot more complex than that. And in fact, sometimes plastics don't necessarily go in this linear fashion. They can go and return back to where they came from. So if you look at these orange boxes on this diagram, these are the sinks of plastics. So we've got things like soils, sediments, and river and ocean water. Then we've got a variety of sources to those. But we know that even plastics that end up within rivers or within the ocean can be returned to land, for example, via flooding during storm events, via air transport, and so on. So it's quite complex, and it's not just linear. So we should think about this like a cycle. So it's been mentioned already, plastics in terrestrial environments, and I wanted to highlight that again here. This is a very difficult area to understand because there have been very few studies quantifying plastics in the terrestrial environment. Although we know that lots of plastics are present, we don't know how much is there exactly and where it accumulates. We know that plastics are used a lot in agriculture, so whether that's to cover fields in plastic mulch or within different chemical processes, plastics might be used for pesticide delivery to the soils, for example. We also know that a lot of worldwide sewage sludge is used as a soil conditioner and a soil fertilizer. And we know that the sewage sludge can contain a large proportion of microplastics, especially microfibers from the wastewater process. This ends up within the soils where it can either be retained or it might then enter waterways via runoff. So if we think about microplastics in wastewater, this is just a very basic diagram of how a wastewater treatment plant works to remove different contaminants throughout its process. And in short, there are a variety of different stages, all the way from primary settlement through to tertiary treatment and the release of effluent. Now we know, of course, that some microplastics might be present within this effluent because wastewater treatment plants are not designed specifically to remove microplastics. However, studies have shown that actually wastewater treatment processes can remove more than 99% of microplastics. And this includes a study that I've carried out. So actually wastewater treatment processes are very effective at removing these particles from the water. However, we also know that due to the very large volumes of wastewater processed every day, actually only one large sewage treatment works could release millions of microplastics. So it's still not an insignificant number. I'd mentioned already the sewage sludge. Actually, while we say that 99% of microplastics are removed, of course, we know that these don't just disappear. They are removed because they are settling within the sewage sludge. And as I mentioned before, this sewage sludge is applied to land as a fertilizer. So the microplastics will still enter the environment in some way. Laundry, we know, is potentially one of the largest sources of microplastics, especially microfibers, to the environment, and especially via wastewater treatment systems. So just as an example, you might wash a fleece jacket. So this is a plastic-based material such as polyester. This goes into your washing machine and the fibers are released. And research has shown that one laundry load, which is on average 6 kilograms of clothing, can release more than 700,000 microfibers in just one wash. So this is really a significant number. This also showed that different types of materials can release different amounts of particles. So we have acrylic being the worst polluter, but then there's polyester and also polyester cotton blends. So we need to consider the material type as well when we're thinking about microfiber release. If we then think about how particles and pollutants in general are input to rivers, there are lots of different ways in which this might happen. So I've mentioned already treated wastewater. This is known as effluent, or sometimes known as grey water. We also have combined sewer overflows. So these are systems that are designed in the UK, and I believe this is worldwide as well, such that when the wastewater system is overwhelmed during storm events, or if there's very heavy rainfall, the sewage treatments, the sewage systems will release into rivers directly. We also have storm drain input. So this is road-derived runoff getting put directly into river systems, then land runoff, drainage ditches from agriculture, and then, of course, litter, if people dump litter directly into rivers. So one of the first studies that I carried out when I was looking to investigate microplastics was around the River Thames in the UK. And I based my hypothesis on the amount of wastewater that would be within the river at any one time, because I believed, as many people have stated, that the larger the amount of wastewater input to the river, the higher the contamination with microplastics. Now, interestingly, what I found is not directly this, because the site that I expected to be the most contaminated turned out to be the second most contaminated. And this was quite confusing, but the reason that I discovered this occurred is because this site here, the most polluted site called the Cut 1, is directly downstream of this storm drain outfall that I showed in the previous slide. So this receives untreated road runoff, which might contain things like road paints, tyre particles, and so on. And this diagram on the right gives a very good indication of how these particles might enter the river, because here we have a red painted road surface. These particles are washing straight down the drain. They are being released directly into the river. And then the particles that you can see in the bottom are ones that I found within my sample. So it's very clear then how these paint and plastic particles are ending up within river systems in the UK. If we then think about oceans, I'd mentioned some plastics, of course, are released directly to the oceans, although it's a smaller proportion than is released via land. But this might be in the form of things like fishing gear, paints from boats, dumping of waste, whether that's legal or illegal dumping. We have litter, again, that might be dumped. And we have these nurdles, so the pre-production pellets that could be lost during shipping accidents, for example. Now, a study carried out by two of my colleagues was looking to quantify microplastics within the Atlantic. So they carried out a transect from the north to the South Atlantic, and as well as taking samples of the surface. So in this image on the right-hand side, you can see samples with depth. They took samples at the surface, but also at around 100 meters depth and 200 meters depth, to take into account the fact that particles might be sinking within the oceans, not just at the surface. So this diagram shows their results in comparison to data that already existed. So on the left-hand side, you have the estimated amount of plastic that we believe has been input to the Atlantic since the 1950s in different pollution scenarios. On the right-hand side, you have my colleagues' data, and you can see that this is much higher in terms of the amount of plastic that was found in their study compared to what we would even expect to be present within the Atlantic. So this is really shocking, because this implies that we don't really understand how much is in the ocean, but it's probably more than we thought. This also shows that actually the largest portions of plastics were found at the higher depth, so around 200 meters compared to the surface. So actually a lot of these plastics are not floating on the surface of the ocean, but they are underneath the surface. One of the reasons as well why we might be seeing this difference is to do with the size of the particles analysed. So the previous studies have only considered particles larger than 300 microns in size. My colleague's study considered particles down to 36 microns. And while you wouldn't necessarily expect that to have such an enormous difference, that could be one of the explanations for why we're seeing so much, because we believe that actually a lot of the particles within the ocean are going to be of this very small size due to fragmentation of plastics. So this really tells us that not all microplastics will be floating. There are many at depth. And this is really important for us to consider when we're doing these surveys of plastics in the oceans. And also that the mass of microplastics is much greater than what we would have expected to find. So I'm just going to touch briefly on microplastics and organisms, because we know, of course, that all this plastic in the environment can have environmental and ecological implications. And the way in which organisms can be exposed will influence those. The likelihood of ingestion and interaction and effects of microplastics on organisms will depend on a variety of factors. So these include things like proximity to source, so how close the organism is to the source of the plastic pollution, the habitat of the organism, the behaviour, the feeding habits, and so on. So how does that organism behave, and is it likely to eat these particles? But then also characteristics of the plastics themselves. So, for example, the particle type or the particle shape. So one of the studies that I've carried out again in the River Thames was looking at ingestion of microplastics by a fish called the common roach. So this is a freshwater fish. And I selected a number of sites around the River Thames basin. So these are the red dots on this map here. And you can see where this is in the UK on the bottom left image. These sites represented a range of different distances downstream from the source of the river. So the results were that I found plastics, especially fibres within the roach. Polymers were identified as being polyethylene, polypropylene and polyester, and actually around 75% of the particles that I found within the fish were fibres. Around 1/3 of the fish that I analysed had at least one microplastic particle within their guts. And if we look at the number of microplastics in fish in relation to the distance from the source of the river, we see that generally we have this increasing ingestion as we go further downstream from the source of the river, so more particles are ingested per fish. We also found differences based on the size of the fish. So the larger the fish, the more particles we would find within the fish. So all of this lends us then to the question, what is the problem with plastic pollution? We know that we're finding it everywhere. We know that organisms are ingesting it, but does this really mean that there's a problem? So we've seen a number of instances where animals can get trapped or entangled. So this is obviously an issue. Animals will accidentally eat plastics. We then see that this can lead to trophic transfer, so from one organism to a higher trophic level. Plastics last for hundreds of years, and this is one of the key issues, is that we don't really understand what this means because the ecosystem exposure is going to be chronic. It'll be very long term, so this could have implications. Plastics contain chemicals that can release into the environment, and these can be potentially toxic chemicals, so there are effects of those as well as the particles themselves. Large plastics will break down into microplastics, and microplastics are more easily ingested. So there are a range of different issues, and it's already been mentioned, of course, that humans are widely exposed to plastics as well, which is a further consideration in this field. However, we do have a lot of remaining questions. So there's a lot that we still don't understand about microplastics and plastics in general. I mean, I've talked a lot about microplastics, but it's really an issue about plastics in general. So firstly, we don't really understand where plastics accumulate and what leads these plastics to accumulate in specific areas. For example, on the sea floor or in remote regions, we find plastics. So why is this? Will there be long-term ecological effects? So I had mentioned that plastics will be around for hundreds of years. So we need to understand what this means for the ecosystems that are exposed to them. How do these future pollution scenarios influence risk? So if we think about the graph that I showed at the beginning and the increasing production of plastics, that will continue to increase in coming years, which will then lend itself to increased ecosystem exposure. And then finally, how can we mitigate? So we need to think of ways in which we can begin to solve this problem. And a few solutions have been proposed today in terms of biodegradable plastics and banning certain products like single-use carrier bags. But we need to have a much bigger think about how we can tackle this problem. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And I'd like to thank you again for inviting me to speak here today.
Thank you so much.